operated as a means to contain calls for an expanded social welfare state. As the hurdles of the law and order regime were established, Coretta Scott King and others took the baton from Randolph and Rustin into the 1970s. She became one of the leading figures in the struggle for guaranteed jobs. In the 2 decades after her husband's death, Scott King devoted herself to achieving governmental guarantees to employment and disentangling violence from the economy. For her, this was the continuation of the civil rights movement. In May 1974, with unemployment having remained above 5% since January and prime interest rates soaring above 9%, the struggle for full employment achieved even greater salience across racial lines. Scott King then began collaborating with other key civil rights and labor leaders to form the Full Employment Action Council and the National Committee for Full Employment. Presciently, when Scott King had written the initial ask to elicit support for the coalition, the unemployment rate was 5%. But by the time the coalition was making headway in January 1975, unemployment had jumped to 8% with no signs of slowing down. For Scott King, she saw her mission as eliminating what she described as all forms of violence, not only criminal kinds of violence, but institutionalized violence. As she explained, quote, "Any form of deprivation is a form of violence. Starving a child is a form of violence. Depriving a person of a job is violence." When asked about what sectors should be prioritized for guaranteed jobs programs, Scott King noted that, quote, "This nation has never honestly dealt with the question of a peacetime economy and what it means in terms of the development within the country. We've had much greater employment during times when we've been engaged in war." As she argued, there are not enough hospitals and there is not enough medical care provided for people. There are not enough public schools. There are not enough teacher aides, nursing aides, that kind of thing. If we build more hospitals, we could put a lot of people to work just building hospitals for sick people. These would be areas of human needs. In contrast to Scott King, leading figures like Alan Greenspan, at the time a member of President Ford's Council of Economic Advisors, announced in June 1975 that, quote, "The recession, for all practical purposes, is over." As if responding to Greenspan directly, 8 months later, in testimony before the Joint Economic Committee, Scott King noted, "We are not actually talking about a recovery from high levels of unemployment, but an acceptance of high unemployment as a permanent part of American life." Scott King emphasized that for Black people, the economic policies and actions of the past few years have been nothing less than a frontal assault on all the gains and victories of the 1960s. She asked the members of Congress, "What good is a promise of fair employment when there is no employment?" And she explained, "Accepting unemployment to control inflation amounts to choosing the people at the very bottom of the economic pyramid to bear the entire burden. In the so-called war against inflation, America's 10 million unemployed have been the administration's conscript army." Scott King and her coalition's efforts went partly achieved. They provided the activist energy behind the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act and helped establish the Federal Reserve's employment mandate. As Scott King announced after its passage, but with many of its most forceful demands removed, quote, "Humphrey Hawkins is the vital first step. All of the gains of the movement my husband led in the 50s and 60s were not accomplished at once." So she announced, "We will be back in Washington year after year after year until there is full employment." Lastly, I'd like to say a few words that speak to the question of design and another panel occurring right after this on the criminal legal system. In 1978, a young but wise congressional staffer, some of you may know him, his name is James Galbraith, emphasized the need in a full employment plan for targeted hiring by group and region. This lesson has added importance when viewed through the historical prism I've offered, and one that emphasizes the rise of mass incarceration. There are currently an estimated 65 million people with criminal records. Their chances on the job market are fairly grim. In Indiana, an employer recently complained to NPR that opioid addiction was so prevalent that she was having to entertain the idea of hiring people with criminal records. Quote, "We are a victim of the lack of workforce in this community, and we've had to, I don't want to say lower or bend our standards, but we've reevaluated," she said. Such statements illuminate the importance of Galbraith's point about the need for targeted hiring for those most discriminated against in the labor market. Would winning a job guarantee in the 1960s or 70s have prevented mass incarceration? That stretches too far into the counterfactual and does not attend to the dialectics and changes of political struggle. But we do know that many of the places where prisons have been cited did not so much as want prisons, but they wanted to materially reproduce themselves in place. They wanted jobs, they wanted to live. As Ruthie Gilmore has shown, the people of Corcoran, California wanted to, quote, fashion a future for their children, and a prison was the only thing on offer. Jack Norton tells a similar story about upstate New York. Judah Shep tells a kindred story about the history of prison growth in Appalachia, alongside the history of decline of coal mining in the region. What would have happened had the Appalachian Committee for Full Employment been successful in the 1960s in pursuit of governmental job guarantees to build housing, medical clinics, and provide vocational, remedial, and adult education? Would the federal government have been unable to build the McCreary or Big Sandy or Manchester prisons in the region? We'll never know. But we do know that prisons continue to be marketed as economic development strategies to places where capital has abandoned, despite evidence that this is a strategy of failure, notwithstanding the human costs as well. We might consider this a different form of what the 1970s formation, Environmentalists for Full Employment, called job blackmail. When communities are forced to choose between environmentally degrading and poisonous jobs and no jobs at all. But the future is unwritten. The urgency of accelerating pressure is best understood against the background of past defeats, Randolph reminded us. The movement for Black Lives, the Black Youth Project 100, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, the Center for Popular Democracy, and many of us in this room are at the heart of a rejuvenated struggle for guaranteed jobs. When and if these struggles succeed, the history of Randolph, Rustin, and Coretta Scott King will cease to be considered defeat and will instead resemble preparation.
Our next speaker is Mark Paul from Duke University.
How's everybody doing today?
Good, thank you.
Good. Glad to hear it. Hard to follow these two. They've laid a fantastic foundation, so thank you. The history and the framing of unemployment as a disease, I think, is critical to further developing what our story is around a job guarantee and really trying to help sell this to the broader public and better inform them of why such policies are vital to bridging economic rights and civil rights in particular, and creating a basic dignity for Americans across the board. So today I want to talk briefly about a federal job guarantee as a way to achieve permanent full employment, in particular in ways to combat poverty, unemployment, and underemployment. So this is broadly based off work with Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton that I've done, and this is a preview of a report that we have coming out hopefully next month with the Center for Budget Policy Priorities, which we're quite excited about to have a relatively mainstream outlet paying quite a bit of attention to a very bold progressive idea such as this. So we've talked quite a bit about the background and the framing, the need for such a job guarantee, but I just briefly want to touch on a few topics here. First, we've had about 52 years of a quote-unquote war on poverty that LBJ started. So about 2 years ago was the 50-year anniversary, and the Council of Economic Advisors put out a report and asked a simple question of, how has that war gone thus far? And broadly, they found that it's been a complete and utter disaster. That said, through the war on poverty and the development of the various social insurance programs that we have reduced poverty nearly by 50% in the U.S. through those programs. So while we've by no means achieved the initial goals of eliminating unemployment and helping to, as LBJ said, reduce despair and replace it with opportunity, we have indeed performed some dent in what we view as poverty. Nevertheless, we still have about 40 million Americans currently living in poverty, and roughly half of the nation's children are living in poverty. And this is a group that's, of course, living in poverty through no fault of their own. Not to say that other groups are living through fault of their own, but children in particular, I think, are a group that's particularly salient to think about here when we're thinking about the potential long-term effects of living in poverty. Those include things such as improper cognitive development that lasts throughout these children's lives, and it's simply based on, as we know, where they were born. While the headline unemployment number, the headline poverty number, 12.7%, is concerning, I think the other thing we need to think about is how does this affect different groups? So for instance, the Black and Hispanic poverty rates are more than twice that as the white poverty rates. So who is it that poverty and unemployment are affecting is something that I think we need to consider much more deeply, and particularly following Galbraith's words that David lifted up earlier. In terms of unemployment, as Pavlina's map showed magnificently, we always have an unemployment problem. This idea that we have full employment, quote unquote, according to the NAIRU, this idea that we have a consistent economic booms and tight labor markets is relatively a farce. I mean, the question is, tight labor markets for who? And nevertheless, we see that we have persistent unemployment, and right now, despite most economists sounding the alarm that we're at or near full employment, we see that there are many more individuals who are actively seeking work than actual job openings. So many of you have probably seen a lot of the write-ups, whether it be in NPR or the New York Times or the Post recently, that employers are constantly complaining that they just can't find workers. And I scratch my head and say, even in an Econ 101 class, you learn they can't find workers. There's this funny thing that an employer can do, and they might be able to try raising the wage, yet that hasn't happened, as we know in the statistics. So clearly employers just want to keep finding workers for poverty level wages rather than decent subsistence wages. So in the US, to address these issues of poverty and unemployment, we do have a broad array of social insurance programs that I mentioned are actually relatively effective at reducing poverty, by no means effective at eliminating poverty. Under Clinton's welfare reform in particular, we transitioned to a work-based safety net. So there's one fundamental problem that I want to harp on about a work-based safety net. If you don't have a viable pathway to employment, how much good is our government programs that subsidize poverty-level employment going to do you? And the answer is not much. So most people think about some of the more popular programs such as TANF and food stamps when they think about quote-unquote welfare or social insurance programs. But I actually want to mention that EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, is the largest poverty reduction program in the United States right now. And what is the EITC? It's basically the government coming in and providing additional funding to households that are earning poverty level wages. In other words, it's a subsidy to employers who basically pay their workers shit, right? And I think that we want to think about how we want to reform a social insurance program and consider what types of assistance we want to be providing and who that assistance is flowing to. So there's actually quite a few really great studies that look at the EITC in particular and show that a lot of the benefits from the EITC are actually captured by the employers themselves. So it's something to be aware of in thinking about policy design in particular. I want to briefly mention two of the issues that were brought up earlier about group-based unemployment in particular. So we've done a lot of work focusing on unemployment rates across various stigmatized groups. And in particular, we find there's a relatively consistent 2-to-1 ratio in unemployment between blacks and whites. And a lot of people will point to the fact that, well, they have different human capital and they live in different areas, and economists love coming up with rationale for why this exists. But we find that the 2-to-1 ratio basically holds across all levels of education. Further, there's a great report by Janelle Jones and John Schmidt that look at black and white students that graduated with a bachelor's degree in a STEM field, which we know that STEM fields are traditionally highly sought after in the labor market. And there as well, we see this persistent 2-to-1 gap. So in a great report that David recently co-authored, they did talk about how during times of near what traditional economists call full employment, which is usually something in the realm of 4 to 6% unemployment, we do see a slight narrowing of that gap. It might come down to 1.7 to 1, the ratio, but nevertheless, workers of color are still much, much more likely to be unemployed. And when we're thinking about building social insurance programs around economic and social justice, I think that that's a very important discrepancy that we should fight strongly to address. One piece of troubling yet slightly promising research that just came out last week was a piece by the San Francisco Fed that looked at discrimination in the labor market since the Civil Rights Act. And they actually found that discrimination for black workers has increased since the Civil Rights Act. And the way economists are thinking about this is the pay gap. So black workers earn about 65 cents on the dollar, but then economists try to take into account XYZ and figure out what is the actual pay gap when you're comparing apples and apples. And they find that it's actually increasing. So this notion that that we're on a march towards justice and that we're making significant progress, I think, is actually potentially misleading and also potentially derailing from the conversations we need to be having. So this right here is just a quick chart to illustrate the unemployment rates by different groups. This bottom line here is the white unemployment rate, and as you can see, this top line here is the black unemployment rate. So the gaps are quite astonishing, I think, and there are, as you noticed, persistent historically. So blacks tend to be the first to be laid off during recession and the last to be rehired during recovery, which explains, in particular, some of what you saw on the maps that Pavlina was showing. We know that the reasons you have these persistent communities that look like they're constantly in crisis is because we have large degrees of segregation, and frequently those are communities of color. However, of course, there are also many rural white communities that are in persistent economic poor situations. So rather than simply tackling unemployment through the job guarantee, the other part of the framing I wanted to bring up that I think is important is that a job is insufficient in and of itself to escape poverty. So if we're thinking about two things, we're thinking about unemployment and poverty, they're inextricably linked, because the primary reason people are in poverty is because they're unemployed or underemployed in the first place. However, the job in and of itself is insufficient. So there's two things that can be insufficient about the job. One is poverty level wages, and then the other one is traditionally thinking about benefits and whether or not the worker is able to achieve employment to the desired degree. So what I mean by that is that we have a large amount of people who are working part-time but seek full-time work, and that also disproportionately afflicts workers of color. The other part I want to mention here is we have this fantastic Fight for 15 movement that I think and hope we are all supporting here in this room. It's done a lot of tremendous work. However, we need to keep in mind that without a job guarantee, the effective minimum wage in this country is still $0, right? I think there's been a lot of quality research that shows that the employment effects of a minimum wage are basically negligible. I think that there's quite quality work by Aaron Dubé on this topic. However, there's still unemployment, and raising the minimum wage doesn't affect those workers that are persistently without a job. So we clearly need to have complementary legislation to other types of policies, such as minimum wage, that are trying to address that. So what is it that we're proposing? What I want to talk to you all about today is a brief bit of policy design that we've come up with. Now, I want to mention that there's a lot of fantastic thinkers here in this room that we're lucky enough to be around, and that I feel as if I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here by being able to propose such work. But there's a lot of different variations of what a job guarantee could look like, and this is just one of those variations, so I want you to keep that in mind. But what we're basically proposing is the permanent creation of the National Investment Employment Corps. And what this organization will basically do is offer a job guarantee for any and all Americans above the age of 18. Okay? So this does not cover youth. However, I certainly want to mention that youth are an important part of thinking about full employment policies. And I think we should have complementary legislation that targets youth, particularly for summer programs. So by no means is mutually exclusive here. In terms of compensation, part of the idea of the program is to eliminate poverty level wages throughout the entire economy. We set the base compensation at $11.83 an hour, which is equivalent to $24,600 a year, which is the poverty line for a family of 4 in the United States. Now, you know the poverty line is, of course, outdated, and you also know that the poverty line does not change regionally. So in turn, what we argue is that while the $11.83 is the base wage, the mean salary in the program should actually be roughly around $32,500. So part of that will take into account things such as education, time on the job. So if I've been working with the job guarantee program for 6 months and haven't found a job in the private sector, and I've been performing my job well, I should be able to receive a raise and advance through the program. Right? We have promotions in the private sector. Why shouldn't we have promotions in the public sector? Especially as workers put the time in. And we also want to use the scale by the Office of Personnel and Management that allows for regional variation. So this is actually a topic that I think that we should all think more about. If you look at places like San Francisco or New York, I mean, what are the optics of us basically pushing more resources towards communities that are high-cost communities versus perhaps incentivizing people to move to lower-cost communities? And it's a really challenging issue to think about the proper way to address. And I'm not necessarily convinced that regional variation is the right way to go. But for now, we're basically advising on using this government scale, which they currently use for their workers, and it's actually, it's quite modest. So it's not like you're gonna see workers in San Francisco pay twice as much as what you see a worker in Oklahoma, because that, I think, would create injustices within the system. We do indeed index the wage to inflation, which I know there's some controversy there, so I look forward to a robust discussion on that topic. And we also couple a benefits package, including health insurance, which is equal to health insurance offered to public elected officials, such as our senators and representatives, parental leave, sick leave, and modest retirement. In terms of program logistics, I want to mention that we have a relatively top-down structure in mind. So it's based largely off of programs that were implemented during the Depression era. We do foresee this program being a part of the Department of Labor, and in particular administered by the Secretary of Labor. Now, the weakest part of this policy design is what happens if we have a bad Secretary of Labor. But there's a lot of mechanisms that you can put into place into the legislation that would allow for the program to be relatively resilient. So localities, whether that be a city, a county, a state government, or an Indian nation, would be able to basically apply to the program for a federal employment grant, where, for instance, they would say, we want to build a hospital, we need $5 million, and we have unemployed workers to employ to do such a thing, or in particular, such a program could be utilized for a whole host of different things, but one important thing that is particularly on my mind these days is thinking about combating climate change and rapidly engaging in a transition to a green economy. And this is one place that the job program could be heavily utilized. The other thing is, both mitigating and adapting to climate change, things of that nature. But the host of potential jobs is quite long. All employees here would be technically federal employees as we design it, and workers would be able to opt in full-time, part-time, but the maximum work hours would be 40 hours. In terms of benefits, benefits would be provided to all workers. However, health insurance would only be provided to full-time workers. We have discussed allowing a buy-in plan for workers working part-time, but as we design it right now, that's the policy design we've taken. Further, we allow 1 workday in the policy design per month for workers to engage in work in professional development, as well as time paid on the job to actively be seeking private employment, which we think is an important part of trying to maintain a well-functioning labor market. In terms of costs, we put together some relatively crude estimates on what the program might cost, simply in a quick snapshot of what if we went from 0 to 100, given the current labor market. What we basically assume is that all workers that are currently counted as U6, unemployed and underemployed, which is a broader notion of unemployment than the traditional unemployment rate, would uptake the program, which would give us roughly 11.4 million full-time equivalent jobs that would be demanded. We're talking about an average cost around $56,000, which would include wages, benefits, as well as material costs that we price out at about 1/3 of the wage rate. We end up with something around $56,000 per job, which would give us a program in the realm of 3% of GDP, just shy of 3% of GDP. But that's not taking into account, for instance, the substantial reduction in social insurance programs that we would see, not by eliminating any social insurance programs, but through reduction in uptake due to reducing need. So that would cut this number nearly in half, is what we find. Of course, there's been the really fantastic work by one of my colleagues and dear friends, Josh Mason, on the macroeconomic potential of the economy, and thinking that's not this number's not taking into account any of the potential growth effects of a program such as the job guarantee that we think would be quite robust. So I want to mention that this is the first stage number, but there's many other factors to take into account. So just to briefly wrap up, I've proposed one form of a job guarantee. I think there's a lot of others. I think right now, given how rapidly this idea is catching on, we really need to be thinking through quite a few more of these details and policy designs, and really thinking about what legislation for a job guarantee could look like, and start putting that down. I also think it's important to think about potential intermediary programs towards a job guarantee, so whether those be pilot programs, whether those be targeted job guarantee programs to start, such as youth employment programs, or really robust employment programs for recently incarcerated individuals or other traditionally stigmatized groups in the labor market. I also want to spend a lot more time, hopefully collectively with some of you, thinking through what are some complementary labor market policies to a job guarantee program. So what comes to my mind is Germany, for example, had a much deeper recession than we did, but their unemployment rate went down during their recession, okay? Ours skyrocketed. Their unemployment rate went down. They engaged in very effective work sharing. I by no means think that this is a solution to our unemployment woes, but I think there's a lot of policies that we can and should consider that would be complementary to the job guarantee. And finally, while the job guarantee eliminates working poverty, it does indeed fall short of eliminating poverty. I know there's been a lot of tension between job guarantee advocates and UBI advocates. I would love to see that tension go away, and then think about these policies more as potentially complementary policies depending on design. Both the job guarantee and something like a UBI are these huge umbrella terms that we have a vast array of policy designs that fall under those. So in particular, thinking about a job guarantee and a negative income tax, for instance, I think is one way for us to consider how is it that we can, A, non-engage in means testing, but B, provide work at non-poverty wages for individuals who seek it, but ensure that individuals that for some reason can't work or choose not to work at a given time can still maintain some reasonable degree of livelihoods. So I'll end there, and thank you for your time.
So for our last speaker of this panel, before we have time for Q&A, we'll have a talk by Jonathan Kruk of Leiden University.
Hi, everybody. I'm, as she mentioned, Jonathan Kruk from Leiden University. I'm a researcher there in the Netherlands, and I also teach international law and human rights at the College of William & Mary in Virginia. And I'm really excited to be here on this great panel, and with all of you. Thank you for coming out so early, and it's standing room only in the back. It's really impressive to be here. And I'm going to talk about, okay, so you're all convinced, everyone's convinced we're going to have this job guarantee program. So now how are we going to implement it? So I'm going to pick up and add on to, okay, what happens when we have the inevitable bad labor secretary? So all of you are the secretaries of labor. You're doing this great job guarantee program. Everything's working perfectly, as everyone's described here. We're in this great new world. But what's going to happen in this kind of situation is corporate interests are going to chip away at the design of the program. There's going to be attempts to discredit this through media and advertising. There's going to be attempts to denigrate this, and there's going to be future elections, and eventually, at some point in time, new administrations are going to come in, and then what's going to happen to this program? That's sort of one problem that's going to occur. How are we going to deal with that? And just sort of another overarching general problem in all of this is that in sort of these kinds of human rights and development projects that are done internationally in the United States, some great ideas and great programs are put in place, but underlying power relations still remain the same. So you're helping people, but you don't really change the underlying power dynamics. So how do you deal with those kinds of issues? So I'm going to argue for what we really need is a job guarantee, and it needs to be an intersectional job guarantee. So I'm going to put forward one possible design. I'm not saying this is the only way to go about it, but this is one possible design of an intersectional job guarantee, what it could possibly look like. So what do I mean by that? First of all, in any kind of job guarantee, there's a need for gender parity in the decision-making process. So first of all, you have to have 50% women making the decisions in the design of the program, what kind of jobs are going to be funded, how they're going to be funded, how it's going to be run. There's no parliament in the entire world that has 50% women's participation, so you need to have this come into the projects in some way. So how do you go about that? Usually what happens in these kind of programs when they try to bring in greater women's participation, you might start to approach higher levels, so it's maybe like 70% males, 30% women, maybe 60-40. Maybe some Nordic countries are getting a little higher, but still you have another problem. You're getting elite women, you're getting women from higher socioeconomic groups. What about the people who really don't have time to participate in these kinds of programs because they're working multiple jobs or doing multiple things, and they're not being included in this. So this is where the intersectional job guarantee program comes in. So ultimately, how do you have a democratic control over a job guarantee? That's sort of the base question. And so one way about this, which is actually being done in practice, and so this is not just theory, it's actually done around the world in different places, which we'll talk about in a second, is what you can do is you can randomly select a group of citizens. So you have like a little mini populace or a citizens assembly or a citizens jury. There's different names for this. And again, this is one possible model. There's other possible models out there. And this randomly selected citizens assembly has some sort of oversight and decision-making function in connection with all of us experts. So an interesting thing happens when you do random selection of a citizenry. So this could be, you could have this at the national level decision-making. You have job guarantee program being run locally in Kansas City, so you could randomly select people from the Kansas City neighborhood, so they're directly involved. So to sort of illustrate this point, you can think of kind of like a little magic trick. So imagine I pull out like a deck of cards. So I'm going to shuffle this deck here. I've got my deck of cards, and I'm going to have you randomly pick 20 cards. Take 20 cards. That's 15, 5 more. So she has 20 cards. Look at your cards. So out of these 20 cards, how many are red and how many are black? You can count them up.
65, 35.
So on average, there'll be 10 and 10. On average over time, and if you do a large enough sample size, most of the time you're going to get 10 and 10, or half and half. So you can think of this deck of cards as one color is the male population, one color is the female population, and you're going to get half a 50-50 gender distribution by randomly selecting a group of citizens. You'll also get other gender identities across that, which will automatically be included in the random selection based on their population in the body that you're randomly selecting from. If you look at your cards again, if you look at how many aces and kings you have and how many 2s and 3s you have, how many do you have, say?
Not enough.
So you're going to have basically equal numbers. So you'll have an equal distribution across all socioeconomic groups. The numbers of 2s and 3s in this randomly selected group of cards will be the same as the numbers of aces and kings. So you're going to get a random selection of, that's going to get a cross-section of socioeconomic groups, of different kinds of identities. This isn't a perfect situation. You're going to still have cultural problems and deeply rooted biases and power issues, but this is a start towards getting a more democratic input into what the job guarantee would look like. All right, so you've got this randomly selected group of people. You've got, for the first time ever, 50% women's participation in some kind of public decision making. Then what happens? So a lot of times people think, okay, this is going to be, some kind of nightmare scenario. You're going to get a bunch of crazy results out of this. Bad things are going to happen. People think of like the bad kind of populism is going to come out of this. But this isn't just theory. This is actually being done around the world in practice, and it works well. So places this has been done, there's all kinds of examples. I'll just mention a couple right now. Iceland, they deregulated their financial industry like the United States. They had a collapse, they had a political crises. People were on the streets, they were mad, their political elite. They decided to come up with a new constitution. And in some of the steps of the constitution drafting process, they randomly selected a group of people. And so for the first time ever, you've got 50% women's participation in a drafting of a state constitution. So this has never happened before in human history. It actually worked really well. People come together from all walks of life, all gender identities, all socioeconomic backgrounds, and there is a role for experts. So experts come in, and so people like all of you come in and say, here's my research, here's my activist work, here's what I'm doing, and here's what I found. And people are reasonable and will listen to that, and we'll decide, okay, I want to hear more of this. We don't like those experts, we don't like what they're saying, let's hear more of Pavlina, and we want to hear more of what she's saying, and they actually come to reasonable conclusions. Interesting things happen when people are sort of face-to-face in groups like this. There's two sort of main centers in the United States that run these kind of programs. There's a guy, James Fishkin, at Stanford University that runs these programs around the world. And he's done this in decision-making, like in all different kinds of places you would never think of. For example, in China, Beijing has concern about local unrest and how municipal budgets are being spent. So what happens is you've got some corrupt bureaucrats in some small town in all over China, and the municipal budget is being spent in some kind of corrupt manner. People are building some kind of factory for their cousin, and they're kicking farmers off their land, and there's riots, and Beijing doesn't like these riots. So they actually brought in Fishkin and Stanford, and they randomly select people from these municipalities, and these people decide how their budget's going to be spent. Well, here's what we want. We really want water sanitation, we really want schools, whatever we want. They don't really do job guarantee. That's something they ought to add in there. But then this is binding on that municipality, and they know best what they want and need. They hear from different experts. They look at the different issues involved, and they come up with good results. There's another center that does this at the University of Maryland. It's called Voices for the People, and they get members of Congress to agree to participate in this program, but it's not really binding, so they can kind of ignore it at the end of it. But this kind of thing needs to be have more binding power. And they get congressional districts around the country. Some are like in Oklahoma, some are in Maryland, and they look at controversial issues. So like they do Social Security reform. And when you take randomly selected people from this congressional district in Oklahoma, you find that actually people are pretty reasonable. They're not really there as members of their party. They're not, okay, I'm the representative of this party, or I'm the representative of the wealthy sector. They're sort of, they interact more, I mean, there's still those kinds of issues, but they're interacting more as citizens trying to work out common good. And the finding in these studies is that people at the higher end of the income spectrum are actually willing to, these are not MMTers, but in their approach, they're willing to have their taxes go up to make Social Security sustainable, which isn't really how it works, but the point is that they're willing to make sacrifices for the greater good, and they start to see that these are not zero-sum games, but together they can have a better community and a better world. So actually there's real-world examples of this. It works well. Other places it's been done. It's usually done for sort of one-off policy issues. So British Columbia and Ontario, two Canadian provinces, did this for electoral reform. They put it in the hands of a randomly selected body. Ireland just recently did this on abortion law reform. Politicians didn't want to touch this issue. And politically, in the electoral environment, reforms like this get skewed. But this randomly selected body recently came up with abortion law reform that was well received and progressive. And there's other examples I can go into. But so the basic idea here is I would argue that for a job guarantee, you should have some sort of democratic input into this. It shouldn't be through the typical electoral system. You should have some sort of randomly selected citizens' assembly. When people get together, they are reasonable. They listen to experts. They can figure out what's in their own best interests. They can figure out, okay, what kind of jobs do we want to fund? How do we want to go about this? And you can have good policy results. Then after you've left your position as Secretary of Labor, a new Secretary of Labor comes in, it's hard for that person to undo this. This is already in place. It'd be an anti-democratic move. I mean, obviously it could potentially happen, but there's a shift in the fundamental power relations where you've got this ongoing body that's harder to undo than if it's just some political appointees who are running the whole program. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
If there are some seats scattered in here, if anyone who's standing at the back wants to try and grab a seat, who's asking questions, but since I don't know your names, it's going to be hard.
So, like, two things that come to mind for me are one,
You'll need to speak up, yeah.
okay, so two things that come to mind for me are one, rather than talk about minimum wages, talk about actual living wages that are aggregated for the change in the economy as well as where people live, and also the redefinition of work. Pavlina has talked about this in the past, and where we redefine what work is, that it's output rather than these antiquated notions about what we really think work is in this very Protestant ethic kind of nation in which we live. So someone could discuss that.
Why don't we get a couple of questions on the board before we launch into answer. So in order, this gentleman and then the gentleman in blue, and then I'll pick up you guys in the next round.
So there's some work, a book by Sacco on When Crime Waves. It claims that mass incarceration was actually a result of changes in media policies to focus on the police blotter and fire basically nearly all the investigative reporters from commercial broadcasting. And I'm wondering how that compares with the other stuff that you were talking about in driving mass incarceration.
And then the last of this first three people.
Hi, I had a question on making sure the geographical scope of unemployment. And I work in California Labor Market Information, and two counties stick out dramatically. Imperial County and Toowoomba County still have unemployment below 15%, where Marin County and San Francisco have around 3% employment. And I wanted to just have the panel or Pavlina just discuss what's the cause behind that geographical differences in unemployment, and is it possibly industry or mix related, whereas in heavily agricultural counties?
All right, so we have three questions, and panelists, do you have a sense of who wants to answer? The first one's about redefining work and talking about living wages rather than minimum wages. So you want to tackle that, Pavlina?
So I think there's a benefit in instituting a base wage, because that is the same benefit as having a minimum wage. You know, we basically, have a standard, a labor standard for the nation as a whole. You know, the way we put in other labor standards of what constitutes, the working day, et cetera. Then with the pay, we can use the job guarantee program to basically formalize a above poverty living minimum wage. Independent cities have their own living wage ordinances, and so one thing you could do is have them supplement those programs with their, with some component, wage component, to comply with the living wage ordinances. The goal, of course, is to have living income. We don't want just people to be barely subsisting, right? So I think this is a matter of how you implement the program and figuring out the disruption that you're going to cause in the economy. We believe that disruption is largely positive disruption, first because we're creating a lot of jobs with a lot of positive social and economic effects. Second, because we would like to put pressure on firms to pay better. So that kind of disruption is, we think is positive. But then the question is, do you go immediately to 15? Do you go? So I think it's more of a strategy. But I think that there has to be a base floor that that it's not a false promise, because the minimum wage today, as Mark was saying, is a false promise. Redefining the meaning of work, we will talk a lot about this. We have another panel on what kinds of jobs, and I'm going to have very concrete examples of what you could do. I'm always baffled when people ask me, but what are the people going to do? I'm just look around how much stuff we need to get done. But I think it is very important to think about work in a different way. It's not your 9-to-5 thing. It's something that embraces your potential to contribute to the community, but also enhance your own life. And so that will then be answered by how we evaluate success. Like, how do we evaluate program success? Do we evaluate it because we build a bridge? Yes, that will be one criteria for evaluation. Are people struggling with childcare responsibilities? Are they also, are we putting other pressures on them because they have to go and work, but we have not provided the supplemental support? Then that's not going to be terribly successful, and we don't want that. So we want, like, I will talk about this, but care to me can be very broadly defined. Care. 80% of our work in the private sector and public sector is reproducing labor. We work to care for each other, feed each other, entertain each other, educate each other. It's service sector. And so this is an opening to broaden, what do we consider to be, public service, et cetera. There was something else on the unemployment. I don't know regionally the specifics of those counties, but my sense is that there is a lot of urban blight. There is a lot of loss of industry. Different regions will have different, farm, agricultural communities. So different regions will have different reasons why there is a persistent unemployment. But then the unemployment problem kind of feeds on itself and is difficult to solve itself. So when we target the program, we're going to have to look and say, is this an agricultural community? What are the kinds of jobs that we will need to, put in there? Because one of the goals of the job guarantee is kind of to fit the jobs to the people and their capacities and their abilities.
Great. So, and the rest of you want to tackle in particular this gentleman's question?
First, I'll say one more thing about care work and the future of work, which is, it might have glossed by, but in that list of things from the March on Washington, when they wrote that they wanted to broaden the Fair Labor Standards Act to include areas of uncovered areas of employment where black people and other minorities work at slave wages, they're thinking specifically of the exclusions in New Deal labor law that excluded domestic workers from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And if we think about the role of home health care workers in the economy today, the fastest growing sector of the economy, we think about why those jobs are not compensated at the levels in which they should, especially considering how difficult and the many skills necessary to do home health care work. We have to think back to the racism and patriarchy that saturated the New Deal. To shift from that to, I'll say one other thing about future of work is that, Coretta Scott King and these movements were always thinking about this. When they were thinking about full employment, they collaborated with an organization that's actually still around called Science for the People to put up solar panels to say that this is what work should look like. So they were thinking about environmental justice and economic justice together in as early as the mid 1970s. To get to your question about mass incarceration, I'm not familiar with that scholar about police blotter stuff. We know that the media has played a big role in creating and sustaining moral panics, in particular around crack cocaine and things like that. At least on a very proximate level, not to get into the deeper structural issues, but on a proximate level, the rise of mass incarceration is due to policy changes in flow of people into the system and the length of their time while incarcerated. So the shifts across, pretty much every jurisdiction to change, things that were once non-criminalized, turn those into misdemeanors. Things that were once misdemeanors, turn those into felonies. Things that were once felonies, add 10 years to the minimum sentence. That's, and you stack that up over year and year and year, and that's how we got mass incarceration. That obviously doesn't get at the deeper levels, but I'll be happy to talk anyone's ear off after about that.
Can I just mention, in New York City, the cost of incarceration per one person is $168,000. How many jobs is that? Job guarantee jobs? 3.
Have all three of these questions been addressed? Yes, so this gentleman has a question, then Vernon behind him, and we'll take in the back. Yeah, so 1, 2, 3.
So I think I have a hard question. We started a group in Seattle trying to popularize MMG and green job programs. one of the pushbacks we're getting is everyone's like, this would be fantastic if the whole country knew this and we were doing this. But are there things we can do in the short term, say like in Seattle, to help marginalized communities and climate change that would be useful to them and then set the example that's going to accelerate this? So kind of in a hostile, say, Trump administration, are there practical things we can do, not just come here and talk and say, that would be great if only, but things that we can do right now that kind of moves us closer? And that's my question, what would you guys recommend?
And that's the question we'll have the definitive answer to. And we're calling a big press conference. Yes, Vernon.
Yeah, I think my question is for David. It's about a proposal from David to have the job guarantee wage variable that varies with tenure or skills or performance, and what impact that has on the job guarantee being a real price stability tool or putting value on the dollar.
The price stability function is
Whoa, whoa,
sort
whoa,
of,
whoa.
do we
We'll
get
get
more?
to
Okay,
your
sorry.
question
Yep,
then.
okay.
So mine is a relatively simple question that I think some of you know is coming. It's, do you think the job guarantee job should be available to non-citizens? If so, what is the residency threshold? What are the eligibility?
Okay. Okay. Three, right? Are we taking more?
There are three questions.
Okay, yeah,
The
got it.
first is
Yep.
about practical things for Seattle and other progressive groups and communities. And the second question is, what's the impact of the variable wage
Yep.
and the job guarantee, particularly around price stability and exchange rates? And the third one is a citizenship requirement or not for the job guarantee.
All right, so very quickly, I think we want to engage in this conversation, what we can do at the local level throughout the next few days. Find sympathetic local policymakers that can lend a friendly ear. I've been talking to people, it would be great to launch pilot programs just to see how we can work out the kinks. Here we have solid budget constraints, so we got to do some cost-benefit analysis to figure out where the localities are spending on just dealing with all of the fallout from unemployment. So there's got to be sort of, that kind of groundwork that needs to happen. The price stabilization feature is the price anchor. It's the wage that actually serves that purpose and the fact that the program fluctuates. The variability is in design, in the type of work that people are being offered to do, so that you don't have a nurse building bridges or things like that. And the final thing on the citizens, thank you for raising that question. If we were to do the job guarantee today, it will have to operate under current law. But current law, as we know, is problematic. I would love to see the job guarantee as the program that is the path to citizenship. That is, it is the program that helps sort of bring in a lot of.
So broadly, I agree with everything Kathleen said, but just to follow up on a couple small points. In terms of what we can do locally, so actually I'm working with a mayoral candidate who's running in Durham, North Carolina, which is where I live, who's running on a job guarantee. Pierce Freelon is his name. I encourage you to look him up. What we are doing practically is putting forth a platform that argues for direct employment of 100,000 workers as an initial pilot. The city doesn't have the money to employ all 6,000 currently unemployed, but it can rearrange its finances to fund 1,000 workers and to start pilots. And I would strongly encourage us all to really work with our city council members to see if we can get some small scale direct employment projects off the ground. I just learned this morning about a direct employment project in Tempe, Arizona, for homeless individuals. So I think showing how work can revolutionize people's lives and our communities simultaneously and provide broad benefits, not only to the people that are getting the job, but to the community at large, is pivotal to making this argument more broadly. The other thing is I think that there are a lot of potentially incremental pieces of legislation at the state or federal level that we could really go after. We have some really promising existing employment programs in place, and I think that we could try to expand some of them, particularly thinking about the two things that I come to are disconnected youth programs. and programs for again individuals who were recently incarcerated. On the citizen issue, I mean, right now, the way we think of it is again operating within current law and saying anybody who has a legal right to work, not just citizens. However, we would certainly like to see that expanded. The other thing, though, is thinking about how the U.S. engages in international aid, and the most important thing is to think about what are real development strategies that benefit the least well-off in other countries. Okay, and if we actually radically rethink the way we engage in aid, I think that is a complementary issue, but by no means addresses how we handle the issue of undocumented individuals in the U.S. right now and how that intersects with the job guarantee. I mean, one positive there is that I foresee is that the two can be complements to some degree. That putting a floor in the labor market will indeed raise wages across the board, and that also will lead to much more robust growth than we're currently seeing. And more robust growth generally means more jobs for all. However, that's by no means a solution to the issue.
We have time for at least another round of questions. I see someone in the back. I see a woman in the second to that. So how about 1, 2, 3, 4? We'll go 4 this time.
Hi, it's lovely to have you all here. I just had a question sort of building on what Jonathan was talking about, which is there are kinds of jobs that for various political or social reasons could be stigmatized or not considered socially valuable by some parts of the community and more valuable by others. Things like, to use as the basic example, medicinal marijuana or sex workers in certain communities and things. And to use your example, the bad Secretary of Labor can definitely be something that could be a sort of side effect of violence against certain communities. So I'm curious how you see, in addition to just the sortition or the kind of randomly selected leadership, or were there any other structural safeguards that could go into place in designing the rhetoric and the legal framing of the guarantee so that it's not something where the kinds of jobs that are considered socially acceptable become susceptible to top-down political pressure and sort of top-down social issues.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could stand.
Really small clarification question. It's more academic than anything else,
Can
really.
you speak up a bit?
I have a small boring academic clarification question, which is that it's for the map. Am I reading this wrong? I was very surprised with the posts, because the posts have the highest number of counties with 10% unemployment. And when the recovery happens, then nothing much seems to be happening around the coasts. Like the dynamism is all in the hinterland. And I was wondering that, what kind of conclusion can be drawn there from the rise of the current president, number 45?
Good question. There was a, yes.
So when people talk about basic incomes, what some of the selling points are potentially reduced work hours. Speak louder. Okay. When people talk about basic income, can you hear me? Okay. When people talk about basic income, people talk about reducing, this could potentially amount to reducing work hours, more leisure, that kind of thing. Better wage. So I'm curious how, for the job guarantee, how do you think about how ambitious to be in terms of, how many hours are going to be required to work? What's the wage? How do you think about how ambitious should the proposal be?
And here.
So I understand that the job guarantee is not a panacea for income inequality or wealth inequality in America. However, in looking at the nature of many of the woes of the poor in the country, having to go to payday lenders, having to find alternative ways of funding food, it seems to me like this is the silver bullet to ending neoliberalism, to taking away at least some of its stranglehold of the people. Can you speak to me about what if we were looking at a Venn diagram, say however much percent of this forced situation is satisfied by the job guarantee, and what some of the other planks of ending income inequality would be that would be complementary to such a program?
All right, so we have 4 questions. Do I need to repeat them, or did most everybody get them? about stigmatized workers, so a democratic backdrop so that people don't get excluded from that, explaining the difference between the dynamics on the coast and the dynamics in the heartland in terms of the virus map, and then what about reducing work hours? And finally, the impact on the host of associated social problems. And Dick.
So on Rohan's question, and then briefly on your question, so I'd say when people think of the Citizens Assembly model, they compare it against, okay, well, that's going to be problematic against some sort of idealized political system. But really, the comparison shouldn't be some sort of utopian system. The comparison should be what's actually going on right now, and it's a really low bar to meet. So this really low bar of what's actually going on in everyday political decision making. The kinds of jobs you just mentioned they're already criminalized, already stigmatized. So I would say it's not really get much worse than that, and that polarization is a function of electoral politics and the mass media around electoral politics. And when people come together, it's really surprising. People who you wouldn't think would support certain kinds of policies when they're actually presented with different kinds of debate and they discuss with other people around the table. People come up with supporting legalization of like the kind of jobs you're mentioning, whereas and this might be the last person you thought would support that kind of thing. So alongside that, I would say you also need human rights standards, and there's ideas that so how do you develop those human rights standards? You could have a separate body doing human rights type standards, putting those in place that the other bodies can't violate, that can help promote what you're talking about. And sort of looking at the sort of global overarching issues, I would say, again, you need shifts in power relations and how that operates, and things like citizen assemblies are sort of one step in that direction of shifting overarching power relations, but there's a whole other litany of issues that need to be addressed, which I'm sure others will talk about.
Before we launch into more responses, I know we're over time. If there are people who have other places to be, maybe right now would be a good time to get up and make your way to wherever else you're supposed to be, and then we'll come back to these.
We'll wrap it up. Yeah, maybe this will be the last.
This will be our last response, but I
go
wanted
ahead.
to give people a chance to, they were looking very anxious.
Neoliberalism?
I guess I'd just say on neoliberalism, but it also speaks to the question of rights for immigrants and a number of these issues is, one thing that history gives us is it gives us a sense of political struggle. And I think if we think about how strong the civil rights movement was, and then we remember that they were not successful in this thing, it gives us a sense of what type of power is necessary for social movements to build in order to get things like a job guarantee, in order to get things like decent rights for immigrants. And so I think the history gives us a sense of what type of power is necessary to build, and that struggles for a job guarantee will be a power struggle.
All right. A quick response on the UBI. Well, the map, the unemployment map, we're now animating the whole history because I want to see whether this is really just a phenomenon of the last 25 years and then investigate why, or is it really the case that coasts have always been plagued with, certain areas with unemployment. So I'm sure there's going to be structural shifts, that are impacting the map and how it looks. So somebody who does like GIS stuff, here maybe can go in and dig into that. UBI, the job guarantee is situated within a broader social agenda of progressive social policy. We do want reduced work hours. The job guarantee can be by providing, as Mark was saying, these options of part-time or full-time, or maybe even provide a reduced working hour, full pay for a reduced working hour a week, could be a way of kind of formalizing that standard for the private sector. So it can be this institutional tool to do these things. We do believe that it should be supplemented with universal child allowance and other benefits. So you're situated in a broader progressive agenda. I seriously doubt that the UBI will lead to reduced working hours or more leisure. I think that UBI will not eliminate economic insecurity, and people will still be seeking scarce jobs, and those who have them will be working longer hours to keep them, and have the work on the conditions that they have been offered to them. So that's a whole other, I think, conversation.
Well, join me in thanking our panelists.